So we are going to pick up where we left off, which is chapter 30. It's on page 1169, 1169 in the Eitz Chaim. And something I neglected to mention last time is about this Parsha, Nitzavim, is always read on the Shabbat before Rosh Hashanah, for reasons that I'll talk about in just a second. But I think it's really interesting how sophisticated the Jewish calendar is. Not only that the calendar itself is very sophisticated, in that, it's a lunar calendar, but gets adjusted according to the solar year. So even though there are 354 days in the lunar calendar, and the solar year is 365, there are a variety of additional days and actually one whole additional month in order to keep the calendar aligned with the solar year, and therefore Pesach always falls out in the spring, right? Rosh Hashanah is always in the fall. Pesach needs to be in the spring. It's Chag HaAviv, the holiday of spring. This is different, of course, from the calendar that Muslims use, as Ramadan floats around the year, because they too have a lunar calendar, but it's not adjusted solar. But then the other thing about the calendar is that it's also adjusted so the Torah is read in its entirety in 1 year. And that means that years like this, where there is an extra month of Adar, some of the portions which in other years would be read together are this year read separately over 2 weeks. And so it's all kind of worked out. And then beyond that, we have the alignment of the Torah readings themselves, sometimes to specific holidays. And here, as I mentioned, this passage is always read before Rosh Hashanah, this Parsha. Last time we looked at chapter 29, actually, most of 29 and where it started, and now we're looking at 30. So again, chapter 31, chapter 30, page 1169 in Eitz Chaim. It goes on to say, when all of these things befall you, right, these things which God has described as happening, depending on whether the people obey or don't obey God, the blessing and the curse that I have set before you, that is, the blessing, if you are obedient, and the curse if you stray. I'd like to make sure everybody is muted. I'm hearing some background noise, so if you're not, please do so. At any rate, you should take them apart amidst the various nations to which the Lord has banished you, right? So clearly Moses thinks there will be times of disobedience. We're going to see this much more clearly shortly. But when the idea here is, think about why this happened to you. Think about why you're experiencing the curse rather than the blessing, and return to the Lord, your God, and that you and your children will heed God's command with your heart and your soul, right? So the idea here is, and the Hebrew word is v'shavta, right? You should return. This is the idea of tshuva, right? And we talked about this not long ago, that the idea of repentance is really returning to the proper path. the reason why this Torah portion is read before Rosh Hashanah and the whole year is finagled in order that that happen is because of this idea that you will return, and this admonition that we must return is appropriate as we are right before Rosh Hashanah. Okay, and we'll see also before long the next parsha of Ha'azinu, which is always read, and it's appropriate to the period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Shabbat Shuvah. Okay, so, and the Lord will restore your fortunes and take you back in love. So the idea that God takes us back in love, right? That the fundamental relationship between God and the people of Israel, it's not just about obedience, right? It's not even, that God has singled us out, but it's much more profound than that. God is a God of emotion. Just as God gets angry with the people, fundamentally, the relationship is one of love. And of course, when one is in love and one is betrayed, then anger necessarily follows. Okay, and here we get the promise that God will bring you back together again from all the people of the earth where the Lord your God has scattered you. Even if your outcasts are at the ends of the world, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there God will fetch you. So the idea here is that the people will be dispersed, and yet they'll be brought back together. And we see this idea actually in the Amidah, which is said 3 times a day, every day, according to Kapseinu Arba Kanfot Haaretz, gather us up from the 4 corners of the world. And so the fundamental idea is that the Jewish people, really God's people, should be in the land that God promised us. And being outside the land is, a sense of punishment almost. There isn't a sense in the Torah that people would willingly choose to leave the land, but that they're being punished, they're scattered, and God will ultimately redeem them and bring them back. As you may know, there's a lively debate going on today in Jewish intellectual circles about the idea of the centrality of the land of Israel, right? Underlying this is a sense that Israel, the land of Israel, and by extension, the state of Israel in that land, is where Jews belong. And that idea has, I'm trying to remember his name, it'll come to me in a minute, a major scholar of Jewish mysticism, among others, wrote a widely publicized piece in which he challenges this fundamental idea and talks about the diaspora as an appropriate place for Jewish people. Of course, it's very controversial right now because of the war in Gaza, and the idea, from the river to the sea, meaning Jews don't belong in the land at all. That claim, and to find a prominent Jewish scholar reinforcing it, right? His name is Magid. At any rate, here the Torah clearly thinks that we need to be gathered back, and that finds itself in the liturgy every day. And we can think in a much more positive light here about the state of Israel bringing back Jews from the diaspora and the magic carpet rather operation, which brought the Jews from Arab lands and the campaign to bring Jews out of Russia, the campaign to bring Ethiopian Jews to Israel. In some ways, all of this stems from this idea that Jews in the diaspora really belong in Israel, and of course, in particular, when they're being oppressed or being oppressed for Jews, which was the case, of course, of Russian Jews and Ethiopian Jews. The diaspora here is the tfutzot, right? There are a couple of Hebrew words for it. One is galut, right? And you hear people say in English, the galut, right, is as an expression of Jews outside of Israel are in galut. And that literally means those who have been expelled. In modern Hebrew, they usually say tfutzot, right, which does not have that theological dimension to it. Anyway, God will eventually gather the people and bring us back. Something I neglected to mention, and I think it's important. The idea of tshuva here in the Torah really comes about as a consequence of punishment. In other words, God's going to disperse us, God's going to punish us, bad things are going to happen to us. We will learn from that, we will do tshuva, and we will be brought back because God loves us. The punishment that we received is like a loving parent who has to discipline their child, right? If you move from the Torah to the prophets, we see a very different idea of tshuva, and that has to do with warning. God does not, here the sense of punishment is more or less inevitable. There, God does not want to punish the people, and therefore they're given an opportunity for tshuva, and only if they fail to do it will the punishment come. So tshuva comes before rather than after the punishment. And the classic example of that, of course, is the story of Jonah, where God sends the prophet to tell people to do tshuva so that the city of Nineveh will not be destroyed. Jonah doesn't want to do it, tries to run away. God forces him to do it. And once he does it, it's extremely effective. And so effective, in fact, that the destruction which was promised and which Jonah actually proclaims never happens, right? A very different idea than what we're seeing here. Okay. And once again, we get the promise. You'll go back. We're now I'm looking at verse 5. God will bring you back to the land that your fathers possessed. You'll possess it, and you'll be prosperous and numerous. And then it says, God will open up the heart and hearts of your heart and the hearts of your offspring, that to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. So if you look here at the Hebrew, it says in English, will open up. That would be vayiftach, God will open. But in Hebrew, it doesn't actually say that. It says, umal Adonai Elohecha et lebavcha. God will circumcise your heart. Right? A very interesting image. Of course, we couldn't circumcise our hearts, but God can. And so, what is this idea of circumcising the heart? And I think it is the antithesis of the idea that the Jewish people are a stiff-necked people, a hard-hearted people, insensitive in a certain way. And God will take off that covering, that we will feel God's presence much more strongly. We won't be hard-hearted. We won't be rebellious. We will, God will help us to, in some sense, be more aware of God's presence. Right? God is there all the time, but we don't see it. Right? We see in Genesis when Jacob, fleeing from Esau, puts his head down on a rock, goes to sleep, has a vision, and he gets up and he says, God is in this place. I didn't know. Right? So here, the heart is being circumcised. Our awareness of God and God's love will be more aware. We will be aware of it, and therefore we will love God with our heart and our soul. And of course, heart and soul, are essentially mind and body, right? Remember that the heart in the Torah is not the seat of, it's not pumping your blood, right? It's the seat of intelligence. It's your mind. And therefore, and your soul, the Hebrew word is nephesh, right? Nephesh is really not a good, soul is not really a good translation of nephesh either. Your nephesh is your physical spirit, your physicality, right? We talk about nefesh kol chai is an expression, right? What is the nefesh of all living things. So a nefesh is not, some spiritual thing, actually. As we often think about soul, but a nefesh just means a life force. And we're no different from the animals in that respect. What makes us different from the animals is that we not only have nefesh, we also have neshama, right? And neshama is, in some sense, that's really the soul. That's the spiritual part of us. And that goes back to the story of Adam and Eve. Actually, the beginning of that story where God creates a human being. It's chapter 2 of the book of Genesis. And then having formed this being, Adam, out of the dust of the earth, God then blows God's breath into this human being, right? And then so that we become a mixture of the dust of the earth, that which is wholly, physicality, but also we have a neshama. A neshama literally means a breath, right? So we have God's breath. We are a connection of the physical and the spiritual. Here, mind and body rather than mind and soul or spirit. Okay. And that God will do this so that we will live, and God will then inflict all the curses upon the enemies and foes who persecuted you. Those curses which came upon you will now be visited upon your enemies who persecuted you, and you will heed the Lord your God and obey the commandments that I enjoin you today. And God will grant you abounding prosperity in all your undertakings, the issue of your womb, the offspring of the cattle, the produce of the soil. For God will again delight in your well-being. And the Hebrew here is God will. It says a God will again, but if you look at the Hebrew, Yashuv Adonai, God will return to this rejoicing. And of course, that's tshuva, right? It's the same root as repentance. So what we're being told is you will return, right? You will do tshuva, and God will return, that is, once again, turn towards you. And then I love this idea. Above, we had this idea of God in a loving relationship with the people of Israel. But here it's even more, right? God will delight in your well-being, right? And the word is sas, right? Sas al avotech, that God will rejoice in you, delight in you. Lasus and sas, right? It's very active kind of delight. It's filled with joy, right? That's the sense of it. So God doesn't want to punish you. You've returned, and God is filled with joy. Again, these very emotional ideas about God's being. Why? Because you are listening to God's voice, and you're observing his mitzvot and his laws that are written in this book of teachings. Sefer HaTorah, this Sefer Torah. And I think clearly these teachings that we are to observe, the Israelites are to observe in this book, seems clearly to be referring to Deuteronomy. Because this is where we had all that legislation that we studied together for many weeks. And then we were told the consequences, what would happen if we followed it, what would happen if we didn't follow it. So again, we have here, Ki tashuv el Adonai Elohecha, because when you return to the Lord your God, and again, with your heart and with your life force, your being. And then we get this really poetic passage. So you have to follow the law that's written in this book. And then Moses goes on to describe the law. Ki ha-mitzvah hazot, asher anochi mitzavecha hayom. And then this law, which I have commanded you today, it's lo nifleit hi mimecha. It's not baffling. It's not strange. You don't need to think hard to understand it. It's not obscure, right? We do have the sense that the more you contemplate the law, the deeper you go, right? That's certainly a rabbinic idea as they try to parse each law. But here Moses is saying, it's not complicated. God told you what to do. You do it, that's it. And then he goes on to say, it's not far away, right? It's right there. You don't, it's not obscure. And then it goes on to say, Lo b'shamayim it's not in the heaven that you should say, who among us can go up to the heavens and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it. Right, it's an interesting phrase because in some ways Moses did go up, right, on top of Mount Sinai and brought it down and imparted it, right? But that's no longer necessary, right? We've got it. So I wanted to share with you now what the rabbis do with this phrase. In this context, it's not difficult. It's not in heaven that someone needs to go up and get it. So I am going to share my screen. And here we have a passage from the Talmud, the Tractatus Baba Metzia. And we have here an earthenware oven, which is cut into segments, and sand is placed between each and every segment. So the rabbis are talking about this oven, right? And they want to know, is it kosher? Is it not? Is it pure or is it not pure? Can it become pure or impure? Because if the oven becomes impure in some sense, you can't use it to make food. Rabbi Eliezer says it's pure, right? Because of the sand, its legal status is not that of a complete vessel, and it's not susceptible to ritual impurity. The other rabbis say it can become ritually impure because even though it has separate elements and those elements are separated by sand, it is nonetheless a complete oven. So this oven, which they discussed, is called the Oven of Achni. And the Gemara says, what's the relevance of Achni? Because an Achni is a snake. And Rabbi Yehuda says that in the name of Shmuel, it is characterized in that manner because the rabbis surrounded it with their statements like a snake, which forms a coil, and deemed it impure. And now we get to really the core of this. So they argued about an oven. Rabbi Eliezer said that it would be kosher, and the other rabbi said no. On the day when they discussed this matter, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion. Right? Rabbi Eliezer gave them lots and lots and lots of proofs, all different kinds of ways of seeing why this is really kosher, but he is unable to convince his colleagues. And after failing to do that, Rabbi Eliezer says to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, and he points to a carob tree, this tree will prove it. And the tree was uprooted from its place 100 cubits, or according to some, 400 cubits. Right? So Rabbi Eliezer has now, in his frustration, he can't convince his colleagues. He now resorts to magic, right? And he says, see that tree, watch this, because I'm right, and it flies through the air. The other rabbis are not impressed. One does not cite halachic proof from a carob tree. What has that got to do with it? Rabbi Eliezer, ups the ante. He says, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, then the stream will prove it. And the water in the stream turns backwards. It begins to flow uphill. And they say to him, sorry, you can't prove it from a stream. And then you really see Rabbi Eliezer's frustration here. He says, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of this study hall will prove it. And the walls of the study hall lean inward and begin to topple. Not very good. Rabbi Yehoshua talks to the walls. Apparently, Eliezer is not the only one who can do this kind of stuff. And he says, if Torah scholars are contending with each other on matters of halakha, what is the nature of your involvement? What do you got to do with this? And the Gemara goes on, the walls did not fall because of the deference due to Rabbi Yehoshua, but they didn't straighten either because of the deference to Rabbi Eliezer, and they still remain leaning. It's like the Tower of Pisa. There, if you could go to Babylonia and where it is, you could see the slanted walls. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer then says to him, and this is the ultimate thing, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, it will be proven from heaven, and a divine voice. In Hebrew, it's a bat call. A bat call is some sort of communication. It literally means the daughter of a voice, a bat call, emerges from heaven, and it says, why are you arguing with Rabbi Eliezer? The halacha is in accordance with him everywhere. He's always right. I don't know if Eliezer is a ventriloquist or this actually happens. Rabbi Yehoshua stood on his feet and he said,
It is not heaven.
and this is our verse. It is not in heaven. Now, notice this is completely out of context, right? In the Torah itself, it's not in heaven so that someone has to go up and get it for you. The Torah is right there, right? It's easy. But here, he's using this verse as an answer to this heavenly voice, saying, "But out." The Torah is not in heaven. And the Gemara says, what is the relevance of Lo Bashamayim He in this context? And we get Rabbi Yirmiyah, who says, since the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, we ignore a divine voice. As you already wrote on Mount Sinai in the Torah, Acharei harabim lahatot, you follow the majority, right? Even though, as it were, God has spoken. Nope, no longer, right? When we're trying to figure out stuff like this, is the oven kosher or not? The majority rules. And since the majority of rabbis disagreed with Eliezer, the halacha is not ruled in accordance with his opinion. And then we get this incredible story. So the Talmud relates, years later, Rabbi Natan encountered Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet. So Elijah is this really interesting figure. In the Bible itself, Elijah almost uniquely does not die. He's one of the only human beings who doesn't die. When his prophetic career comes to an end, a chariot descends from heaven and he is, swept off. And so as a result, he can show up. He's not gone forever. And there are these stories in the Talmud where rabbis are kind of, they meet Elijah. And when you meet him, you get to ask a question. So Rabbi Natan saw Elijah and he says, that thing with the oven and Rabbi Eliezer, what did the Holy One, blessed be God, do at that time? Right? How did God respond to the voice from heaven being ignored? And Elijah says, God smiled and he said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me. So let me stop the share. And where is that? I always have trouble with these things. This is new share. I don't want a new share. Bear with me. Where is it? Oh, here it is. Okay, and I'm going to open this up, having looked at this remarkable story. And I welcome your questions on this or any of the things we saw from the Torah. Questions or comments? Yeah, Saul.
Well, I wanted to say first that the passages you read from the Torah, starting with, I guess, passage 4, sentence 4 to sentence 6, 4 to 6. Mm-hmm. This is in the traditional machzorim for Yom Kippur before Shema Kolenu, and it's also in the slichot that we do every morning, if we do it before the services before Rosh Hashanah up to Yom Kippur.
Yes, and it also, in a slightly different form, is in the traditional text of the prayer for the land of Israel. So it's wide, like many things in the Torah, they are taken out and they are adapted. We see lots of it in our prayer services, both for the special holidays and also on regular occasions. Good. Anything else? Yes, Sandy. Unmute.
So Rabbi, is the majority, is that always used? I mean, how is that treated, the majority besides something?
So the idea, it's actually interesting because not always. There's sometimes you'll find in the Talmud, and even in the Mishnah, you'll see the Hachamim, the sages, say one thing, and Rabbi so and so says another, and the halacha actually follows the rabbi rather than the majority, right? So it's quoted, and it's being quoted in a way, in an argumentative fashion here, right? So it's not so consistent. And if you go back actually to the verse, it's very interesting because rather than actually say, always follow the majority, what it says is, don't follow the majority to sin. Even though everybody's going to says you should do X, if it's wrong, you don't do it. Right. So both the verse in Deuteronomy that we are looking at was taken out of context, right? And also that verse is taken out of not only taken out of context, but its meaning is actually reversed. Right. We're saying, well, we follow the majority. So I love this story on many levels. The idea of rabbinic authority means that the rabbis can determine what the law is in any day and in any circumstance, and apply the Torah in ways that were not originally intended. It's about the rabbinic ability to create law, and in some sense to change law, to keep the law alive. And the story with Elijah the prophet is in part suggesting that that's the way the Torah was intended. God's delight, they're doing what I want, right? That I've given the Torah not as a dead document that you should be slavish in following, but it needs to be interpreted, right? The other thing about this is the story itself, you could look at it in a couple of ways, but you could say that it's the end of prophecy. Right? Because there's in the rabbinic period and thereafter, we don't have prophets anymore. Torah replaces prophecy, and rabbinic interpretation replaces prophecy, right? So this is, in some sense, the marker. Voice from heaven? No more. We don't get them anymore, right? And you could even argue, in some ways, that it's the end of magic, right? Do magic tricks? Doesn't work. Doesn't impress us. It's also interesting to me that the things that Rabbi Eliezer uses, right, the carob tree and the water, are themselves symbolic of Torah. It's Chaim Hi, right? The Torah is a tree of life to those who hold on it, and the Torah is also compared to living water, to water that sustains people. And so it's a very clever midrash, and it operates on a variety of different levels. I think it's one of the most remarkable, and I will, grant you that's not the meaning of this text, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to teach it. Okay, but let's go back to Moses and the claims that he's making. So the Torah is not difficult to understand. It's not into heaven. It's not beyond the seas. No one has to make some journey to get it. Saying, who among us can cross to the other side of the sea? No, it is very close to you, in your mouth, in your heart. And the word in your mouth, right? Beficha, literally in your peh, right? In Hebrew, in modern Hebrew, we talk about learning something ba'al peh, right? Memorizing, right? That this should be like that, right? Should be in your mouth. And think about the Shema, right? These words, you should speak of them to your children morning and night, and so on. Okay, and then so Moses is saying, hey, it's not difficult. It's right there. And I set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. This is another way of saying the blessings, right, and the curses. I command you this day to love God, to walk in God's ways, to keep God's commandments and laws and rules, that you may thrive and increase, that the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are about to enter and possess. And again, Moses is just again and again and again trying to drill this message in, right? If your heart turns away, you give no heed, you're lured to worship and service of other gods, I declare this day you will perish. You won't live long, and on the soil that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess, I call heaven and earth to witness, right? And we're going to see Moses is very shortly, we're going to come to Ha'azinu, which is Moses's song. And Ha'azinu, Moses does two things at the very end of his life. One is a poem, and then there's also a statement about each of the tribes and what will befall them. And you can see this at the beginning of chapter 32, which is on page 1185. Ha'azinu hashamayim va'adabera tishma haaretz imri fi. Give ear, heavens, that I speak. Let the earth hear the words that I utter. Right? Heaven and earth are going to be witnesses. So there are number of different thoughts about how we can understand this. One is to say, by calling heaven and earth as witnesses, they will also be the agents of God's will. That they will be used. The earth, remember what are the punishments? The heavens will not bring rain. The earth will become like iron, right? So God is invoking them. This is what's going to happen, and I'm bringing them into it. But there's another way to look at it, and that is to see this as a kind of linguistic fossil. A linguistic fossil is a phrase in language that had a meaning at one time, but really has lost its import. And if you look at lots of ancient pagan texts, you see something similar, but here it's gods, the God of heaven, right? That kind of thing, who are being invoked. And this may just be in Moses's context, of course, can't be calling on gods to do this, but the language may just be part of, the general language of the ancient Near East. At any rate, Moses places a choice, and he says, choose life. Free will, right? You get to choose the right thing, choose life. And the idea of life here is not just for you as an individual, but it's really for you as a people. Right? Think back to Numbers, the second paragraph of the Shema, do these things that you may live a long time on the land that God has given you. clearly talking about the people of Israel, right? Rather than the individual. And you'll do that by loving God, heeding his commands, holding fast to him. And this is really a great image. Looking in verse 20, Davkabo, cling to him. I mean, holding fast doesn't really, doesn't capture, right? In Hebrew, the word for glue is devek, right? Stick yourself to God. This idea of clinging to the divine, a very powerful metaphor. And by the way, the same root, you probably heard of this sort of a superstitious folk belief in a Dybbuk, right? The spirit who comes and inhabits someone from Devek clings to you, right? This spirit, right? But here you are to cling to God. You're supposed to have that passion for God, not just, loving God is even too weak, really. And you manifest that by following God's commands, right? Love has to be enacted. It's not just a feeling. And then you'll endure on the soil that the Lord swore to your ancestors to give to them. Okay, so we finished 30, and we're going to move on next week to 31. We're going to close out this book pretty fast now. We're really coming towards the end, and then we'll move on to Joshua. And by the time we get to the next chapter, actually, we're going to be sort of foreshadowing the death of Moses, and we'll be seeing Joshua begin to assume the role, which will lead him, bring him to the role of leader, which we will then see dramatically sort of enacted in the book of Joshua, which will follow. So, any questions, comments about any of this before we go? Hannah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now everybody's on mute.
I wonder how many other religions allow their people to disagree like that. I think it's kind of
Yeah, I think that is that idea of disagreement, right? Of a multiplicity of voices, and even, challenging God, right? Ignore the bot call, ignore the heavenly voice, right? That is fundamental to Judaism, and is very different from, certain, people who, I mean, I've taught a large number of people who studied for conversion, and for some of them, one of the most appealing, particularly Catholics, one of the most appealing things about Judaism is this, right? It's not the catechism, right? It's not, we believe and you must believe, and this is now within the Catholic Church itself, there were disputes over the years, right? Deep disputes and heresies and so on, but ultimately there's one way, right? Here, and what's really interesting to me about these rabbinic disputes is that the arguments and the positions of people who don't win, right? The halakha does not follow them. Their arguments are still kept. It's a little bit like the Supreme Court, right, where you have the dissents, which also get published. And like there, the dissents can become the basis for rethinking this issue in other contexts, right? So it's not just that people disagree, but the disagreement is enshrined, and it's considered, even the losing side is considered to have value. Anything else? Anybody else? Yeah, Saul.
Yeah, first of all, that phrase of "Acharta b'chayim" is, I always think about that, especially here from this parsha. And the other thing I wanted to mention was the way the calendar is fixed. Every once in a while, there's an exception, and this year there's an exception because it depends on when Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur come. So this year, I looked it up in the Luach before. The Tzavim Vayelach are combined.
Yes. Yes. But it's not that they need to be separate, but it still needs to be before Rosh Hashanah, right? It's interesting this year. I mean, you're right to point it out. Virtually no, in a leap year like this, you have very little combined parshiot. I never liked years like this because some of the part when I was, in the pulpit, some of the parshiot, like particularly Tazria Mitzora, right, which deals with, with the skin disease and like you want it to be 1 week, trying to find things to talk about for 2 consecutive weeks, not so easy. But this year it's all pretty much good. Anything else? All right. Well, I want to wish everybody a really good week. We will continue on next week, and I'll see you then. Very good. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.